Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Let's return to the story mentioned there at the top of the programme, and it is about the report from the Information Commissioner, Elizabeth Denham. She's been giving evidence to the Department of Media, Culture and Sports Committee in the Houses of Parliament as she releases her latest report on an investigation into the use of data analytics in political campaigns, and particular whether there have been any misuse of personal data and therefore breaches of data protection law during the EU referendum. Our reporter Manveen Rana has been listening to all of that. Manveen, what are the key findings?
Well, so they found that there has been a breach of data laws. Basically, it seems that when LeaveEU was set up, Arron Banks already had Eldon Insurance, an insurance company, and they found evidence that LeaveEU was given access to the database of Eldon Insurance. So people who'd signed up for insurance policies were suddenly getting emails encouraging them to vote to leave the EU. It's interesting because there seems to have been a two-way breach of these data laws. So after the referendum, when LeaveEU have a database of Leave supporters, they suddenly start to receive adverts for Go Skippy, which is one of Arron Banks's insurance companies too. And because of that, Arron Banks's companies and his campaign group, LeaveEU, are now being, there's an intention to fine them a total of £135,000. It's important to say this is all under one section of data laws, and Elizabeth Denham, the Information Commissioner, wanted to make it clear that there is still an audit taking place, and that will consider whether data protection laws were also broken, and there are much higher fines attached to that.
Manveen, thank you very much. I'm going to welcome Carol Cadwallader, who's come into the studio, journalist at The Observer, and you've written an awful lot about this and broke the story about Cambridge Analytica and their role in the campaign. What's your reaction to the fines that have been levelled at LeaveEU, which was not the official campaign during the EU referendum?
Well, it's extraordinary. Last week we had Arron Banks being referred to the National Crime Agency, the Electoral Commission saying we don't know where he got his money from. Then on Sunday we learn of another investigation into him by the Financial Conduct Authority. Today we have news about data crimes that have been committed. Now these are extremely serious because Arron Banks was running his Leave campaign, Nigel Farage's Leave campaign, from within his insurance headquarters in Bristol. And what the Information Commissioner has been looking at is the crossover in data between insurance data and between election
for which they've been
data.
fined.
Well, now there's a really important point here. They have been fined for using political data for insurance purposes. But it's the investigation into whether insurance data was used for political targeting is still ongoing, and that's the really, really key consideration.
I'm going to read the response from LeaveEU, which is the Information Commissioner notice of intent to fine us and due process for a right to reply has effectively been sabotaged by leaking the findings to the press and publishing in advance of the information. The Commissioner's appearance today before the Damien Collins Committee, which is the Media, Culture and Sports Committee, what started as Guardian DCMS witch hunt over dark data involving Facebook and Cambridge Analytica has ended with a fine for an accidental transmission of a newsletter to an undefined number of people, which resulted in only one complaint to the company and no complaints to the Information Commissioner. For the record, the person complaining received a £40 voucher and a sincere apology. All of our companies take data protection extremely seriously.
Well, I reported Arron Banks to the ICO, and another academic, Paul Livia de Hay, reported him for this. So that's just absolute rubbish, to be honest with you. And it's just the idea of it being a witch hunt is just a way of smearing the very serious investigations by our legal regulators and journalists who've been working on this for a long time.
Liam?
Well, I'm not here to defend Arron Banks. It does strike me that the discussion last weekend, I got quite a lot of experience in international business. It didn't strike me as unusual that you use a holding company in another jurisdiction. So I don't think those...
And you're referring to Arron Banks being asked about the source of his £8 million donation.
I don't think... Well, I don't think those allegations quite stuck. But I do think these ones, on first reading, and I'm just absorbing the report as all of us are, do seem more concerning, particularly if the fine has already been levied and there seems to be a clear breach. I guess if Leave.eu were here, they would probably say that there's also been lots of allegations on the other side.
And we're going to come to those.
Debate, if you like. For instance, the Lib Dems apparently sold some of their political data to Britain Stronger in Europe. I mean, I think in general, a lot of the country just wants us to get on with this process, and we're completely bogged down in how the referendum was actually conducted.
Actually, we're bogged down.
Hang on, I'm just going to ask, how big a deal do you think this is? Because if you listen to what Carol has said, and you listen to Liam saying that people would just like to get on with the referendum, the sort of summary, if you like, from the report from the Information Commissioner says they have uncovered a disturbing disregard for voters' personal privacy, and they found that not just with Leave.eu, but the questions to answer from the official Vote Leave campaign and also on the Remain side.
I think that the public are starting to ask themselves some quite serious questions about data, and especially new technology like Facebook and social media that's kind of galloped ahead of the regulatory framework. So I think the public take this seriously. I think politicians have got to take it seriously.
What does that mean, though, taking it seriously?
I think it means asking ourselves some questions about whether the regulations are good enough. Now, this discussion that we've just been having is about specific investigations, and I think it's really important that we let them take their course and that we allow those regulators to do their jobs. But in terms of the future, you know, we know, I think, that the regulations around elections are probably not what they should be, and I think we're all going to have to work actually on a pretty cross-party basis to get it right for the future.
Are you shocked by the revelations?
Of course I am. So, because going forward, the way in which data is managed is going to be a critical thing for any election process. And we always pride ourselves in the UK that it is fair and honest. This doesn't appear to be at first examination. So I would say it is concerning. It's right that it's pursued by the officials, as we've heard. And more importantly, it's right that there are regulations that everyone respects going forward.
And I think that select committees are proving their worth in the House of Commons at the moment. I hope that this demonstrates to people that actually there are functions in Parliament that can work well, and we should use them more.
Grace, where are you on this?
I think, you know, this is a particular example of a more general trend, which is that we're seeing increasingly the use of personal data for private profit. And this is, you know, a trend that, as you were saying, goes across the kind of big tech companies. We've also seen recently the ICO referring Facebook to Irish authorities over its role in kind of advertising and those sorts of things. So I think, you know, there's a big problem here about the way in which personal data is being used as a kind of private commodity. This is information on people's wants, needs, desires, fears that's being used, you know, by private corporations to attempt to manipulate them. And the regulation simply hasn't kept pace.
All right, well, let's... Yes,
Can I leap in? So these are all really good points, and you're absolutely correct that going forward, the law has to be changed around electoral law, the use of data in campaigns, and that's what this incredible investigation by the ICO is showing. But it is not enough just to look forward. We know that multiple crimes were committed during the EU referendum. We know that other multiple crimes have been alleged and are being investigated.
Well, let's pick up on that, because you say multiple crimes. You say multiple crimes.
Yes.
We've talked about Leave.eu and they've been fined, and
Well,
that's been
there's
detailed.
another investigation that I want to pick up on, which we haven't mentioned yet,
Right.
by the Metropolitan Police into LeaveEU's spending. That's also an investigation.
We're going to move on to Vote Leave, because that was the official campaign, and it's covered in this report also in some detail. And she says, the Information Commissioner, we established that AIQ, which is the Canadian data firm Aggregate IQ, had access to the personal data of UK voters provided by the Vote Leave campaign. We investigated where it accessed that personal data and whether AIQ continued to hold personal data made available to it by Vote Leave. We know that Vote Leave had a commercial relationship with the company. In respect of that work, we have not obtained any evidence that Vote Leave transferred or processed personal data outside the UK unlawfully, or that it processed personal data without the consent of data subjects. However, we are investigating how Vote Leave delivered electronic marketing communications and whether its actions contravened regulations on privacy and electronic communications. We have cause for concern, and we will be reporting on this imminently. That doesn't sound like a smoking gun to me, Carol.
Well, we've already had a big smoking gun, which is we've had the biggest financial overspend this century, which has been referred to the Metropolitan Police.
And that is being dealt with. But looking at this from the Information Commissioner, she did a first report in July. This is the second report. She's being questioned on it. Are you surprised by her conclusions regarding Vote Leave and the commercial relationship they had with AIQ?
Not really, because the big problem about the use of AIQ by the official Leave campaign and by 3 other campaigns was that they deliberately chose this tiny, obscure Canadian company that was based above an optician shop off the west coast of Canada. And the question we've always had is, why? Why did they choose a company outside of British jurisdiction? Why? And one of the reasons which we were very concerned about that was it was happening offshore. And so the Commissioner says in that report that they had enormous difficulties even trying to investigate the use of data.
All right.
Because AIQ said we're outside of your jurisdiction.
I mean, Alison, when we are looking at the Remain side, and particularly the Liberal Democrats, which is what Liam Halligan mentioned, they were investigated for selling data for £100,000, data of people that they had details of. Are you shocked by that?
Well, it's not good, is it? And I think that the Information Commissioner has got to be allowed to have absolute scrutiny powers. And, you know, one of the questions I ask myself listening to all of this discussion is, have they got enough powers? Are the potential fines significant enough? But, you know, as Carol quite rightly said before, I accept that a lot of the things that I think about are about the future. Meanwhile, these investigations have got to be allowed to happen, and they've got to be allowed to carry on without, you know, politicians too much passing comment. They just get to get on with the job.
I'd agree with all that. Of course, electoral law hasn't caught up with the real world of big data. Big data is the new big oil. We need to get our arms around this as a government, as a political class, and try and bring some proper regulations to bear. Even non-electoral law, the civil law and criminal law hasn't caught up with big data. I have to say, though, in the interest of balance, you know, shoot me down, I think everybody agrees, if we're being really objective here, that while there are definitely things to investigate on both sides, I can feel Carol glaring at me as I'm looking at you, Joe. I think everybody agrees, certainly Electoral Reform Commission, that Remain still massively outspent Leave. This has to be said, sorry.
Because of the money that was spent by the government in the run-up to the campaign.
On the leaflet that went out lawfully, but it was a lot more. 9 million more was spent by the government on that leaflet. And I think it has to be said also that as well as Remain massively outspending Leave, the Remain side had the whole apparatus of the government on its side, the Treasury report talking about profound and immediate economic shocks that never actually happened.
Well,
Sorry,
do you agree with Leave.eu, which say this is a smear campaign, that this is an attempt to undermine
Joe, you've known me a long time. You
do.
Can't go from one extreme to the other.
No.
So there are shades of grey here. This whole thing is a huge shade of grey. I'm not saying it's a smear campaign. I've said twice now, of course there are legitimate things to investigate, and I read everything you write on this subject, Carol, and chapeau to you. But on the other hand, we also have to say, every time we talk about this and devote a whole programme to it, that Remain massively outspent Leave. And would we be having this discussion if the result had gone the other way?
Right, we're just going to sort of unpick the two things. There is the spending issue, and we've already mentioned Arron Banks being investigated by the National Crime Agency for the source of a loan. This is looking at the data, this report, and the Information Commissioner said we're still looking at how the Remain side of the referendum campaign handled personal data, including the electoral roll, and we'll be considering whether there are any breaches of data protection or electoral law requiring further action there. To return to the Liberal Democrats selling the personal data of its party members to Britain Stronger in Europe for £100,000, they've denied that they sold that data. They said instead that the in-campaign bought electoral register information. Is that a good enough explanation?
No, it's obviously... I mean, it's such a dark and murky world, this trade of data. But I'd really like to say one thing, which is that there's a word here we haven't mentioned yet, and it's very key and important, and that is Facebook. So we've got to remember that this entire election campaign, the referendum, was conducted on social media and primarily on Facebook. Now, the DCMS committee, Damien Collins' committee, they have asked now 4 times for Mark Zuckerberg to come to Britain and answer questions about what happened on his platform in darkness during the referendum. And 3 times he's refused. Now, it's really, really important. And because the government has failed to back up Parliament on this issue.
Well, on that, Grace, would you like to see Mark Zuckerberg come before the committee?
I mean, yeah, I did mention Facebook earlier, actually.
You did?
And I think, you know, what we need to look at here is why, you're right, why is the government kind of failing to address many of these issues? And it's obviously because, no state wants to really take on and address the power of these huge multinational tech corporations that have demonstrated that they're able to kind of, use advertising in certain ways, that have been able to kind of, undermine the sovereign decisions of democratic governments and basically operate however they want all around the world. And I think, it really requires a very strong response from our government, from governments all around Europe, from around the US, in response to these corporations that are basically kind of trying to undermine democratic governments all over the world.
The elephant in the room on what Grace is saying is the substantive issue that we're actually debating, which is the role of supranational organisations like the European Union. And the part of the reason why I still think our country would be better off staying in the European Union is because countries acting in concert like that could have some chance of dealing with global multinationals. As it is, we are all the time undoing the kind of diplomatic relationships that might help us tackle it, because globalisation, is not a complete force for good, is it? So states have to work together to tackle where the power lies these days, which is in big global corporates.
Do we need the EU to do that, to actually tackle abuses if they exist by tech companies and their role in elections?
No, we don't. I don't disagree. They can should be able to play a positive role. But there's a word missing very simply from the conversation. You said Facebook was missing, but I think there's another word that's missing, is simply morality. So when you ask me the question about selling lists, it's wrong. Anyone in business will tell you it's wrong. It's not what the public expect, and that has got to be reflected in law. There's one other point as well, and the Chancellor, on a very different issue, demonstrated last week that unilaterally sometimes you have to step forward in terms of the digital tax. Distant from this, I accept, but
yes,
it was a willingness to act unilaterally, and we may have to do that.
That digital tax, I mean, it does indicate that actually, far from being forced to operate on these measures, multilaterally, that you can take steps forward unilaterally. But the digital tax raises just £400 million from these corporations that are huge multinational corporations. We lose billions of pounds to tax avoidance every year, and all that money is going into potholes.
I just wanted to say I totally back Carol's point about Facebook, and yet our political and business classes are far too close, particularly our political class and big tech. The revolving doors between both either way are ridiculous. When we look back on this period, it would be just like looking back on the late 19th century in America, the Rockefellers, the Carnegie Mellons. We need a Teddy Roosevelt to grab hold of this and impose some antitrust on these companies. And I think, in the end, big countries that are culturally big in policy terms like the UK can take unilateral action, because international action will never happen.
We're going to have to end it. I'm sorry, Carol, we're going to have to let you go, but thank you for coming in.